The heat in Alabama in July of 1948 didn't just sit on you, it owned you. It rose in shimmering waves off the asphalt, turning the horizon into a watery blur and baking the red clay dust until it coated the back of your throat. Joe Louis gripped the steering wheel of his Buick, his large, calloused hands steady despite the sweat trickling down his temple. He was tired, not the bone-deep exhaustion of the 12th round against a heavy hitter, but the weary grinding fatigue of a black man traveling through the Jim Crow South. He was 34 years old. He was the heavyweight champion of the world. He was a national hero who had defeated Max Schmeling and, by proxy, the ideology of Nazi Germany. But here, on this lonely stretch of road between Birmingham and Mobile, none of that mattered. Here, he was just another colored man in a white Sony world. His manager, Marshall Miles, wiped his face with a damp handkerchief and told Joe they needed to stop because the engine was running hot. In the back seat, Manny Seaman, his trainer, leaned forward and pointed out a place up ahead on the right. It was a small clapboard structure that looked like it was leaning away from the wind. The paint, once white, was peeling in long, gray strips. A neon sign buzzed with the frantic energy of a dying insect. O'Connell's Diner, but it wasn't the neon that caught Joe's eye. It was the piece of cardboard taped to the inside of the front window. The letters were hand-painted in angry black strokes. Whites only, no colored served. Joe slowed the car. The gravel crunched loudly as he pulled onto the dirt lot. Manny told him not to do it, to keep driving so they could find a grocery store in the next town. Marshall added softly that it wasn't worth it, that Joe didn't have to prove anything to these people. Joe Louis sat there for a long moment. He looked at the sign. He thought about the letters he received from black soldiers who had fought for a country that wouldn't let them vote. He thought about the dignity he had carried into the ring for 11 years. "I'm hungry," Joe said simply. He opened the door and stepped out into the stifling heat. Marshall and Manny exchanged a worried glance, then scrambled to follow him. They knew that walk. It was the methodical, stalking pace Joe used to corner an opponent. It was the walk of a man who had made up his mind. When Joe Louis pushed open the screen door, the rusty hinges screamed. A cheerful bell jingled above the frame, announcing their arrival. The sound died instantly, swallowed by the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. There were about a dozen people inside, 2 truck drivers at the counter, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths, a family in a booth, the mother's hand instinctively reaching out to cover her child's hand, farmers with sun-baked necks, turning slowly on their stools, every eye fixed on the massive figure in the doorway. Behind the counter stood the owner. He was a bull of a man, Frank O'Connell. He was in his late 50s, with a stained apron stretched tight over a substantial gut and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and resentment. This diner was his kingdom, inherited from his father, ruled by the unwritten but ironclad laws of his ancestors. Frank's eyes went wide. For a second, recognition flashed across his face. Everyone knew Joe Louis. His face was in the papers, on the newsreels. For a heartbeat, Frank was just a fan looking at a legend. Then, the reality of 1948 Alabama crashed back in. Frank remembered who he was, and more importantly, where he was. His expression hardened. "We don't serve your kind here," Frank barked. His voice was loud, practiced. It was a voice designed to make men shrink. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned over the counter. "Can't you read the sign in the window? Boy, get out." The silence in the diner stretched tight as a piano wire. A fly buzzed against the glass, the only sound in the world. Joe Louis didn't flinch. He didn't look at the floor. He walked slowly to the counter, his eyes locked on Frank's. "I can read just fine," Joe said. His voice was calm, devoid of the anger that Frank was trying to provoke. "I've read a great many things. I've read the Constitution. I've read the letters from soldiers, white and colored, who died in the same mud in Europe." Frank's face flushed a deep, angry red. He shouted that he didn't care what Joe had read, that this was his property, and he had the God-given right to refuse service to anyone he pleased. He threatened to call the sheriff and have Joe thrown in a cell. Joe stopped at the counter. He was close enough to smell the stale coffee and the fear coming off the man. "You know who I am, don't you?" Joe asked gently. Frank hesitated. The lack of aggression threw him off balance. He admitted he knew who he was. "You're Joe Louis, the prize fighter." "That's right," Joe nodded. "I am a prize fighter. I am the heavyweight champion of the world. For 11 years, I have defended that title against every man they put in front of me. I fought men who wanted to kill me. I fought men who hated me just because I was breathing." Frank crossed his massive arms, trying to regain his authority, and asked what his point was. "My point," Joe said, his voice dropping an octave, turning into steel, "is that I could walk behind that counter right now, and there is not a single thing you could do to stop me. I could knock you out before you could blink. I could tear that sign down and smash every bottle on your shelves. I could make you regret every hateful word you've ever spoken." The air in the diner seemed to vanish. Frank's hand dropped below the counter. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the handle of the sawed-off baseball bat. He kept there for trouble. "But I'm not going to do that, Mr. O'Connell," Joe continued, his tone softening, the steel wrapping itself in velvet. "You know why? Because I didn't come here to fight you. I came here to talk to you." Frank's grip on the bat loosened slightly. He blinked, confused. Joe leaned in, his dark eyes searching Frank's pale, watery ones. "I want to know who taught you to hate." The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Frank O'Connell opened his mouth to shout, to bluster, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the diner for support, but his regulars were staring at their plates or watching Joe with wide eyes. "My dad. My daddy," Frank stammered finally. The anger was leaking out of him, replaced by defensiveness. "My daddy taught me. He taught me that whites and Colorados don't mix. That ain't right. That's just how things are." Joe asked who taught his daddy. "His daddy, I suppose," Frank answered. "And so it goes," Joe said, nodding slowly. "Generation after generation. Fathers teaching their sons to be afraid. Teaching them to hate people they don't even know. It's a heavy weight to carry, Frank." Joe shifted his weight, leaning an elbow on the counter. He looked less like a boxer now, and more like a weary traveler trying to solve a puzzle. "Let me tell you something about my life, Frank. Can I call you Frank?" Frank didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He just stood there, listening. "I grew up poor in Alabama, not far from here," Joe said. "When I started boxing, it was a way out, a way to be somebody. Along the way, a lot of people helped me. My trainer, Manny here, Joe gestured to the white man standing by the door. "He's been with me through my toughest fights. He's wiped the blood off my face. He's held me up when I couldn't stand." Joe paused. "My manager Marshall, he's white. I've had white sparring partners. I've fought white opponents who shook my hand after the bell rang. And you know what I learned, Frank? I learned that white people aren't all the same. Just like black people aren't all the same. There are good men and bad men of every color under God's sun." "That's different," Frank muttered, though he sounded unsure. "Those are your people. They work for you. Joe said firmly that it wasn't different. They are just people. That is the point. When I look at you right now, Frank, I don't see a white man I'm supposed to hate. I see a man who is scared. Frank bristled. His pride stung, and shot back that he wasn't scared of nothing. Yes, you are. Joe corrected him gently. You are scared of change. You are scared that if you treat a colored man like a human being, your whole world might fall apart. Maybe you're scared your daddy would be ashamed of you. Maybe you're scared your neighbors will talk. Maybe you're scared that admitting you are wrong all these years means you've been carrying all this hate for nothing. Frank's jaw worked. He looked at the sign in the window, then back at Joe. He looked like a man waking up from a long, confusing dream. Joe turned his back to the counter and looked at the patrons. How many of you agree with Frank? He asked the room. How many of you truly believe in your hearts that God wants that sign in the window? Silence answered him. A truck driver cleared his throat and looked away. A woman in a floral dress touched her husband's arm. Finally, the woman spoke up, her voice trembling. Frank, maybe, maybe it's time. The world is changing. Frank snapped that he didn't care about the world, but the fire was gone. He sounded tired. Joe turned back to him. Here is what I believe, Frank. I believe we are judged by our actions, not our skin. I believe hate eats you up inside, and I believe it is never, ever too late for a man to change. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He placed it flat on the counter. I want to buy lunch for everyone in this diner, Joe said. Everyone. I want us all to sit down and eat together as Americans. Frank stared at the money. It lay there on the worn linoleum like a challenge. He whispered that he wasn't taking the money. Why not? Joe asked. Is it because my hand is black? Frank faltered. I thought money was the one thing in this country that didn't have a color, Joe said quietly. A nervous chuckle rippled through the room. The tension, which had been a physical weight on their chests, began to crack. Joe leaned in close. Frank, listen to me. 10 years from now, maybe 20, you're going to be an old man. You're going to look back on your life. Are you going to be proud that you kept a hateful sign in your window? Are you going to tell your grandchildren that you refused to serve Joe Louis because you were scared? Or ... Are you going to tell them about the day you were brave enough to change? Frank O'Connell looked down at his hands. They were trembling. His eyes were rimmed with red. I don't know how, he whispered, his voice thick. I don't know how to be different. This is all I've ever known. Joe Louis smiled. It wasn't the smile of a conqueror, but of a brother. You start right now, Frank. You start by taking down that sign. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant passing of a car on the highway. Then, Frank O'Connell untied his apron. He laid it on the counter. He walked out from behind the station, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He walked past Joe, past Manny and Marshall, straight to the front window. His hand shook as he reached up. He grabbed the corner of the cardboard sign. With a sharp rip, he tore it from the glass. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Frank stood there holding the sign, the symbol of his father's world, the symbol of his own fear. Then, he crumpled it into a ball and jammed it into the trash can by the door. When he turned around, tears were streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the grease and sweat. I'm sorry, Frank said, his voice breaking into a sob. I'm sorry for that sign. I'm sorry for turning people away. I've been a fool. Joe Louis walked over. He put a massive hand on Frank's shoulder. That, Joe said softly, is the bravest thing I have seen a man do in a long, long time, and I've seen a lot of brave men." Frank wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at Joe, really looked at him, for the first time. "Now," Joe boomed, his voice returning to its normal volume. "How about that lunch? I promised these good people a meal, and I am starving." Frank managed a watery smile. "Coming right up, champ. Coming right up." That afternoon, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, the impossible happened. Joe Louis, Marshall Miles, and Manny Seaman sat at the counter of O'Connell's diner. They ate burgers and fries. The truck drivers came over to shake Joe's hand. The woman in the floral dress asked for an autograph on a napkin. The air was lighter. The heat outside was still oppressive, but inside, something had broken. Frank O'Connell cooked and served them all with a respect he had never shown a black man in his life. Before Joe left, Frank pulled him aside. "Mr. Louis," Frank said, "you changed my life today. I don't expect you to believe me, but I mean it. I'm going to be better." "I believe you, Frank," Joe said, "and I'll be checking in on you." Joe kept his promise. Over the next few years, whenever he traveled that road, he stopped. Each time, he found the diner a little more welcoming. Frank hired a black cook. He took down the other segregated signs in town that he had influence over. He lost friends, but he gained his soul. Years later, in the 1960s, Frank wrote Joe a letter. "You knocked the hate right out of me without ever raising a fist," Frank wrote. "You taught me that true strength isn't about holding on to the past. It's about having the courage to let it go." When Frank passed away, his family told Joe that serving him that cheeseburger in 1948 was the proudest moment of Frank's life. Joe Louis rarely spoke about the incident to the press. If asked, he would simply shrug. "I just had a talk with a man," he'd say. He did the hard part himself. But those who knew the story knew the truth. Joe Louis had walked into a fortress of hate armed only with his dignity and an unshakable belief in humanity. He had proven that while any fighter can knock a man down, it takes a true champion to lift a man up. And on a dusty road in Alabama, Joe Louis won a victory that no record book could ever hold.